On the 12th of May, 1943, Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim transmitted his final radio message to Hitler's headquarters. It contained no strategic proposals, no requests for reinforcements, only 3 words. Ammunition expended. I surrender. A few hours later, British soldiers found him in a command bunker at Cape Bon. Next to him stood an untouched cup of coffee. The commander of Army Group Africa was surrendering, along with the remnants of what 2 years earlier had been the Third Reich's finest expeditionary corps. To understand how 200,000 German and Italian soldiers ended up as prisoners on a narrow strip of African land in May 43, one must go back 6 months to October 42. It was then, 1,200 kilometers from Tunis near El Alamein, that the countdown to catastrophe began. On the 23rd of October 1942, at 21 hours and 40 minutes, the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery commenced an artillery barrage along the entire front line at El Alamein. 882 guns fired simultaneously. About 400 shells rained down on the German-Italian positions every minute. For the German defensive line, this meant one thing: the beginning of what the Afrika Korps had always feared most, a war of attrition, where British superiority in men, tanks, and supply would grind down any tactical flexibility. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was at that moment undergoing medical treatment in Austria. He suffered from anemia and a chronic stomach ailment. He was replaced by General Stumme, who, on the first day of the battle, died of a heart attack right in his command vehicle. An army without a commander. On the second day of the largest battle in Africa. Rommel returned on the 3rd of November. By that time, Panzer Army Africa had lost about 2/3 of its armored strength. Out of 500 tanks, only about 120 remained operational. The British had breached the defensive mine belt, losing significantly more vehicles than the Germans in the process, but possessing what Rommel did not: another 1,500 tanks in reserve. Convoys from Alexandria flowed continuously. German convoys from Italy sank. On the 4th of November, Rommel made the decision to retreat. An order that saved what could still be saved. He relayed it to Berlin and received an immediate reply from Hitler. Hold your positions, victory or death. A literal order, victory or death. Rommel disobeyed. At his own peril, he began the withdrawal. This decision allowed the preservation of the Afrika Korps' combat-ready corps, about 70,000 German soldiers and about 100,000 Italians. But it could not achieve the main thing: reverse the course of the war in this theater. The retreat from El Alamein stretched for 3,000 kilometers, from the Egyptian border through Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, all the way to Tunisia itself. It was there, ever further west, that the German-Italian army moved under the blows of the British 8th Army, which constantly threatened its flanks. On the 8th of November 1942, 4 days after the retreat began, American and British troops landed on the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts of North Africa. Operation Torch. 108,000 Allied soldiers, the first major strategic amphibious landing by the United States in the Second World War. Now the German-Italian force found itself between 2 fires. From the east, Montgomery. From the west, American General Dwight Eisenhower and British General Kenneth Anderson. Hitler had a choice. Not a good one. There were no good choices left in North Africa, but a choice nonetheless. Either organize an evacuation across the Strait of Tunis while the sea could still be covered by air, or transfer sufficient forces to Tunisia to turn it into a true bridgehead, with a chance for a prolonged defense. Or else admit that the African theater was exhausted, preserve 200,000 experienced soldiers, and move them to other fronts. He chose a fourth option: to do none of the above, but loudly call it the impregnable fortress of Africa. On the 9th of November 1942, the first German paratroopers landed at Tunisian airfields, even before Allied troops managed to seize the country. It was the right idea, executed in the wrong way. The deployment speed was maximal, but resources did not follow. Hitler decided to hold Tunisia as a political symbol. Surrendering Africa would mean admitting defeat to the Italian ally, to his own people, to the whole world, especially after Stalingrad. And Stalingrad was unfolding at that very time. On the 19th of November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a strike against the flanks of Army Group B. The 6th Army of Paulus was encircled. A quiet crisis began at Hitler's headquarters, which no one named aloud. There were not enough resources for anything simultaneously. Neither for relieving Paulus, nor for seriously supplying Tunisia, nor for building reserves in Europe. Tunisia demanded fuel, ammunition, and aircraft. It received a third of what was necessary. This was not a strategy. It was the slow outlining of a catastrophe. By January 1943, the Afrika Korps completed its retreat and occupied defensive positions on the Mareth Line in southern Tunisia, old French fortifications built before the war against Italian Libya. The total Axis force in Tunisia by this time numbered about 120,000 German soldiers and about 110,000 Italians, almost 250,000 men on a scrap of land about 200 kilometers across. It sounds impressive on paper. Reality was different. Supplies for the force came by sea across the Strait of Tunis and by air across the Mediterranean. Both routes were interdicted and sunk with increasing effectiveness. By January 43, the British and American navies had established firm control over the western Mediterranean. British submarines based in Malta patrolled all supply routes. Italian convoys heading to Tunisia suffered losses of 30 to 50% of their tonnage. These are official German figures from the quartermaster service logs of the Afrika Korps, partially published in the West German historical collection Das Deutsche Reich unter Zweiter Weltkrieg in 1990. Of every 2 ships that sailed with cargo for Tunisia, 1 did not reach the shore. Aerial supply was scarcely better. German Junkers 52 transport aircraft crossed the Mediterranean in groups, escorted by fighters. But by January 43, the Allies had concentrated enough interceptors over the Strait of Tunis to turn every flight into a deadly lottery. On the 18th of April 1943, over Cape Bon, American Lockheed P-38 fighters intercepted a convoy of 18 Junkers 52s escorted by 7 Messerschmitt 109s. All of this took place literally within sight of the Tunisian coast, at an altitude of less than 300 meters above the sea. In 12 minutes, the Americans shot down all 18 transports and 4 fighters. The Germans lost about 150 crew members and the entire cargo. The Allies lost 2 pilots. This day entered American aviation history under the unofficial name Palm Sunday. The battle occurred on Sunday, the 18th of April, the last Sunday before Easter. 150 airmen and the entire cargo, in 12 minutes. As supplies dwindled, the German command attempted to use the last real chance for active operations. On the 14th of February 1943, German armored units struck through the Kasserine Pass against American positions in central Tunisia. This was the first major battle of the American army with the Wehrmacht in Europe and Africa, and the Americans lost it. Rommel's armored units, the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions under the command of General Arnim, breached the American defenses within a day. The soldiers of the United States Second Corps under the command of Major General Lloyd Friedendahl fled. They did not retreat, did not organize a withdrawal. They fled, abandoning equipment. By the evening of the 15th of February, German tanks had advanced more than 100 kilometers into the American positions. Brigadier General Paul Robinette, commander of an armored brigade, wrote in his diary, "Friedendahl directed the battle by telephone from a bunker 120 kilometers from the front line. He never once went out to see the positions with his own eyes." The American army lost at Kasserine about 6,700 men killed, wounded, and captured, about 200 armored vehicles, and nearly 500 guns. But Rommel could not exploit the success, not because the Americans held, because he had no fuel. The German tanks halted on the captured lines, literally due to empty tanks. The attack on Le Crib and Tabessa, which could have gotten into the rear of the entire American grouping, was cancelled. There were no resources for it. Hitler in those days sent Rommel a congratulatory telegram and a decoration. Rommel wrote in his diary, "The victory at Kasserine yields nothing. We need fuel, we need shells, we need reinforcements. We received a decoration." On the 6th of March, 1943, Rommel launched the last major offensive against British positions on the Mareth Line, Operation Ochsenkopf. 3 panzer divisions attacked Montgomery's positions from the flank. The British knew about the strike in advance. Intelligence intercepted German radio traffic and decrypted it via the Ultra system, the existence of which the German command did not suspect until the end of the war. The attack failed with losses of about 2,500 men and 40 tanks. After this, Rommel left for Europe, officially for treatment, in fact forever. He would never return to Africa. Command was assumed by General von Arnim, a man who was a good military administrator but not Rommel. Meanwhile, the noose tightened. By March of 1943, the Allies had completed the reorganization of their forces in North Africa. The British General Harold Alexander was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. Under his command were 3 armies, the British 8th under Montgomery from the east, the British 1st under Anderson from the west, and the reorganized American 2nd Corps under a new commander, Major General George Patton, who replaced the discredited Friedendahl. On the 5th of March, Patton arrived at the Corps headquarters. By army order, he immediately prohibited appearing without steel helmets, without combat medals, and without neckties, even at the front. Patrol officers received orders to fine soldiers on the spot for uniform violations. It seemed absurd, but in 6 weeks, Patton transformed the demoralized 2nd Corps into a combat-ready formation. It took 6 weeks and iron discipline, which no one understood, but everyone followed. On the 17th of March, the Allies began the assault on the Mareth Line. Montgomery attacked head-on. The New Zealand Corps under General Freyberg struck in a flanking maneuver from the south through the desert. German units withdrew, but in an organized manner. German infantry and defense remained dangerous even without fuel and shells. The withdrawal proceeded along pre-designated lines, with rearguard actions slowing the British pursuit. But there was nowhere left to retreat. By April of 1943, the German-Italian grouping was compressed into a bridgehead about 100 kilometers deep, roughly a square between Bizerte, Tunis, Cape Bon, and Gafsa. Supply finally collapsed after the disaster over the strait on Palm Sunday. The daily fuel requirement of the Tunisian grouping was about 2,000 tons. In reality, between 200 and 300 were delivered. This was not just a shortage, it was a death sentence. German and Italian units transitioned to static defense, not because they received such an order, but because tanks could not move without fuel. Artillery fell silent battery by battery. The infantry dug into the ground and waited. On the 6th of May, 1943, the Allies began the final offensive along the entire front, Operation Vulcan. The British 2nd Corps struck towards Tunis from the north, the 9th Corps from the west, the American 2nd Corps towards Bizerte. From the air, about 3,000 Allied aircraft operated against several dozen remaining serviceable German machines. The German aviation grouping in Tunisia by this time had been largely destroyed on airfields or lost in air battles. There was no fuel for sorties. On the 7th of May, 1943, British troops entered Tunis. On the same day, American units occupied Bizerte. The gap between the two cities, about 60 kilometers, was covered in one day. Then began the finale, which German veterans later called Tunisgrad, a direct reference to what had happened in Stalingrad 4 months earlier. German units retreated towards Cape Bon, the last promontory of the Tunisian coast jutting into the Mediterranean. Italian columns also converged there, towards the shore. People moved along roads clogged with abandoned equipment, wounded, military trucks without fuel, and civilian refugees. The shore seemed like salvation, but ships did not come. The Italian fleet was too weak to break the Allied naval blockade. German submarines could evacuate only a handful. Transport aircraft no longer flew. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander-in-chief of German forces in the Mediterranean theater, requested Hitler's permission for evacuation. Hitler refused. Tunisia must be held. It is politically necessary. Politically necessary. 200,000 men on the shore without ships. Politically necessary. On the 8th of May, the 15th Panzer Division ceased resistance, one of the veteran symbols of the Afrika Korps, which had fought in North Africa since 1941. Lieutenant Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded the division's reconnaissance battalion, later wrote in his memoirs, Soldaten an der Ostfront. We burned the last documents. I looked at my men. Many of them had served in the Corps from the very beginning. They did not cry, but in the eyes of each one could be read the same thing. All of this had been in vain. On the 9th of May, the 90th Light Infantry Division. On the 10th of May, the 5th Panzer Army in its entirety. On the 12th of May, von Arnim surrendered. The official figures recorded by the Allied headquarters are as follows: 240,000 prisoners of war. Of these, about 125,000 were German soldiers, and about 115,000 Italian. In terms of the number of prisoners captured, this was the largest capitulation on the Western theater of war. Larger than at Dunkirk, larger than at Tobruk. 240,000 at once. But the military significance of this number is not in the sheer quantity of prisoners. It is in the qualitative composition of those captured. In the Tunisian cauldron, a significant portion of the veteran German units of North Africa was killed or captured. Men with 2 and 3 years of combat experience in desert conditions, in mobile warfare, in confronting Allied aviation and armor. There was no one to replace them. The Eastern Front was devouring replacements faster than the war industry could produce them. Hitler learned of von Arnim's surrender the next day. According to the accounts of his adjutants, he reacted with silence. There was no fury, no search for the guilty, which usually followed military disasters. There was silence. That in itself spoke volumes. Now, about what was happening behind the scenes. The main question of the Tunisian disaster is not how the Germans lost the battle. The German units fought in Tunisia professionally and steadfastly. This is acknowledged by both British and American sources. The real question is different. Why did the command, understanding the inevitability of defeat, not attempt a timely evacuation? The answer is divided into 3 parts. First, politics. Tunisia was a symbol. After Stalingrad, Hitler could not afford another public disaster within a few months. Holding Tunisia provided space for a propaganda narrative. The African fortress holds. The threat to Malta persists. The Allies are tied down on this theater. The reality of these narratives did not matter. The main thing, they worked domestically. Second, logistics. Evacuating 200,000 men across the Strait of Tunis under British dominance at sea and in the air was, to be honest, an extremely difficult operation even with the best organization. For comparison, the British evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940 evacuated 330,000 men, but from the opposite shore, right off the coast of England, with a temporary weakening of German pressure and with the availability of hundreds of small vessels. In Tunisia, there was nothing similar. Italy did not possess a sufficient merchant fleet. The German Navy in the Mediterranean was weak. Realistically, according to the estimates of German staff analysts at the time, it would have been possible to evacuate between 30 and 50,000 men, if the operation began immediately, no later than April 43. Had the evacuation begun in April, perhaps 50,000 could have been saved. They waited until May. They saved no one. Third, self-deception. The headquarters in Tunisia sent optimistic reports to Berlin. Berlin sent optimistic orders back. Neither side spoke aloud what was obvious. The bridgehead was not viable. This phenomenon, when headquarters and high command mutually encourage each other in the unwillingness to acknowledge reality, German military historian Karl-Heinz Frieser called in his works, "the trap of hierarchical loyalty." A commander reporting a worsening situation risks being accused of defeatism. High command, acknowledging the inevitability of defeat, is obliged to make a politically painful decision. It is easier to exchange papers with numbers that obligate no one to anything. This is how the machine worked until the very end. On the 12th of May 43, columns of prisoners stretched along Tunisian roads to the north towards the camps. British and American officers accepting the surrender noted the same thing in their reports. German soldiers surrendered in an organized manner, in formation, often with weapons in hand, until the official command was given. The rank-and-file infantrymen were exhausted, unshaven, in many places half-dressed, but they held themselves together. Non-commissioned officers maintained order until the last second. This was an army that was finished off not by panic or moral collapse. It was finished off by the lack of fuel, ammunition, and ships for retreat. American correspondent Ernie Pyle, observing the surrender of German units near Bizerte, wrote in his report, "They were being marched down the road past us. There were so many of them, so many that you couldn't grasp it. This is the end." One of the German officers asked me in English, "Why couldn't you have come sooner?" I didn't know what to tell him. Why couldn't you have come sooner? This is not a prisoner's question to the victor. It is a soldier's question to the war that placed him there, without fuel, without ships, without an order to retreat. The Allies fought in Tunisia for 6 months and lost about 76,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. German-Italian losses killed and wounded, about 40,000 men only in the final phase of the campaign, plus 240,000 prisoners. Across the entire North African campaign from November 42 to May 43, German losses amounted to about 90,000 men killed alone. Data from the German Research Institute for Military History, published in an academic collection in 1995. What did the Tunisian disaster mean strategically? First and foremost, with the loss of Tunisia, North Africa ceased to exist as a theater of war for the Axis powers. The Mediterranean opened up for Allied convoys. Malta, which a year earlier had been under threat of complete strangulation, now became a reliable base. The route from Gibraltar to Suez, which previously went around the Cape of Good Hope, became short again. Second, the Allies gained a bridgehead for a strike at the soft underbelly of Europe, Sicily. Operation Husky began on the 10th of July 1943, exactly 2 months after the surrender in Tunisia. The 240,000 prisoners captured in Tunisia could not defend Sicily. Third, the German army lost in Tunisia men who were impossible to replace. Not in number, the losses on the Eastern Front were colossal, precisely in quality. The combat experience accumulated in 2 years of African war went into prisoner of war camps in Algeria and Texas. Rommel saw all of this back in March. In his famous report to Hitler, which he flew to Berlin to deliver on the 19th of March, 1943, he spoke plainly. Tunisia cannot be held, supplies are insufficient, an immediate evacuation of combat-ready units is necessary. Hitler listened to him and said the report was excessively defeatist in character. After that, Rommel never again held a command in Africa. Rommel's report, rejected, in March 43, 240,000 prisoners in May. Between these 2 points, not a war, a decision. If there is a story from this campaign in your grandfather's or great-grandfather's family, from German captivity in Algeria, from an American camp in Texas, from the ranks of the British 8th Army or the American 2nd Corps, write it in the comments. Such stories are not kept in archives. They are kept in families, and they deserve to be found. War ends with documents. History does not. There is another angle on the Tunisian story, one that rarely appears in general overviews. It is the perspective of the Italian soldiers. The Italian units in Tunisia fought under conditions of even more acute supply shortages than the Germans. The Italian Navy suffered catastrophic losses from British submarines and aircraft, and it was Italian merchant vessels that formed the backbone of the convoy flow to Tunisia. In individual episodes, Italian infantry held positions no worse than the German. the 101st Motorized Division Trieste and the 16th Infantry Division Pistoia, suffered losses in rearguard actions on par with the units of the Afrika Korps. But in German staff reports, the Italians were invariably listed as an unreliable ally, and this opinion was reproduced after the war by German memoirists, forming a persistent myth. The reality was different. Italian soldiers fought with weapons that were worse than the German, with supplies that were worse than the German. Without proper anti-tank guns, the Italian 47mm anti-tank gun model 1936 could not penetrate the armor of a Grant or a Sherman at normal combat ranges. Without proper tanks, by 1943, the Italian medium tank M1340 was so obsolete that early series British Matildas would have been a serious opponent for it. The Italian soldiers in Tunisia fought with what they had, and in May 43, they surrendered into captivity along with all the rest. 115,000 Italian prisoners of war. Most of them ended up in Algeria, some in camps in the United States, some in Great Britain. Many of them did not return home immediately after the war. Repatriation dragged on until 46 to 48 for part of the contingent. These were years without family, without work, without the chance to rebuild anything. Their war ended on the 12th of May, 43, at Cape Bon. For many of them, quite literally not on the enemy's shore, but on the shore of their own future, which someone else erased for them with a single stroke of a pencil on a staff map in Berlin. The Tunisian disaster was not inevitable. This is not a consolation. It is a cold, analytical fact. In November 1942, when the Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria, the German command still had room for maneuver. The troops in North Africa could have begun to be withdrawn across the Strait of Sicily, while the Allied fleet had not yet completely closed the ring, while air cover was still possible. The majority of the veterans could have been saved. Their experience would have been useful in Italy, in Normandy, in the defense of the Reich. Instead, they were left to die on the shore, slowly, for 5 months. Some military historians call Tunisia a miniature Stalingrad. In terms of the number of prisoners, the similar logic of encirclement, the refusal of a timely withdrawal. But this comparison is inaccurate. At Stalingrad, the encirclement ring closed suddenly, and breaking out of it required a breakthrough through Soviet armies. In Tunisia, the sea remained open for several months. The evacuation was not carried out not because it was physically impossible, but because it was politically undesirable. These are different things. A military disaster and a political decision. These are different things. The soldiers standing at Cape Bon in May 43 paid for the latter. If your grandfathers or great-grandfathers served in the coastal army, held positions near Sevastopol, were in that captivity, or survived the meat grinder of 1942, write about it in the comments. Almost none of these people remain. Every unrecorded story is a story that disappears forever.